Hello again. I'm going to go into a little more depth on the three sociological theory groups, three or four, and their offspring. Okay. Then as now, sociologists have been interested in how social forces and institutional change in the economy, educational system, the polity, meaning the government, the political system, have affects the lives of individuals, their quality of life. Weber would use a term called life chances, which are your odds of getting whatever it is you value out of life. Life chances is a very useful term. Um, so, for really up for about 1,000 years, from the year 750 to the year 1750, life didn't change all that much for the majority of people in the world. And I'm going to start focusing on Europe again because that is where sociology as we know it developed. Um, in the mid 8th century, 727, I believe, the Battle of Poitiers, Charles Martel defeated a force of from Spain, I believe. And Islam was spreading throughout the world, and they were defeated in southern France, and Europe kind of hunkered down for a while. They had less to do with the rest of the world as they understood it. Of course, they had no knowledge of the Western Hemisphere at all, and very little knowledge of the Far East. But nevertheless, people basically, there was change over this 1,000 year period of time, but it wasn't the sort that affected most people. The majority of humankind, pardon me, lived pretty much at a subsistence level, just barely surviving. A single bad harvest, because we're for the most part totally dependent upon agriculture. Most people were involved in growing food, raising animals of some sort. A bad harvest, a drought, something along those lines could result in the starvation of a lot of people. People weren't really making money and saving it and so forth. They tended to, well, for maybe 600 years, the European society was characterized by something called feudalism, which is rather than today where people are kind of held together by market relationships, economic relationships, as well as the family ties, of course. The society was held together through mutual obligations between those people who controlled land and those who did not control the land. A, uh, ra- a, a an individual would enter into an agreement with someone of the higher social status, and that person of the higher status often had a lot of land available, and the peasants, they were often called, or serfs. The serf would live on a portion of the land of the lord, perhaps you might call it. This is the period of the classical period of knights in armor and so forth, castles, kings, and etc. The kings weren't as powerful as they were later. Um, the the serf would agree to, in exchange for having a place to live and a plot of ground to cultivate, he would cultivate extra food, grain, whatever it was, and provide that to the lord of the manor. The lord of the manor, the higher status individual, liege lord, often they were called, would ensure that the those that were beneath him were taken care of to a certain extent. If that person got sick, he would make sure that he remained fed. He wouldn't just be allowed to just die in isolation, he or she. If the person's oxen died, the Lord might provide them with a new one. So, so there was a mutual obligations. The serf is providing food, something which the lord of the manor can use and sell the excess of for, or barter in some way. and the Lord is providing protection and support. So, and further up the chain, you had these liege lords who had one above those, and at some level, what they owed the ones above them was not food or agricultural products or some sort of manufactured goods. By manufacture, I do mean by hand, manus. It would provide military service. So if there was a conflict between two people at a fairly high status, they could call upon many people below them who kept a horse and weapons and so forth, who could call people below them, and they could engage in some armed conflict. So, and life carried on without a lot of variation on that theme. There was some, but not a lot for most people, until the Industrial Revolution, the late 18th century, primarily in England, and humans began to be able to manufacture goods industrially using machines and manufacturing a lot more goods than they had in the past. Fewer people were required to engage in agriculture because agriculture was made more efficient as well. It kind of began in England because England was ahead of many other countries in Europe in agricultural improvements. They were applying fertilizer, rotating fields, and other things earlier than many other nations. And so the Industrial Revolution changed the way people lived, the way they made their living, the way they related to other people. These serfs who might have been living upon some land which was owned by the lord of the manor found they had to leave because relationships transitioned from being those of mutual obligation to market relationships. The landlords, as they became known, rather, could rent the land to people and not have to worry about getting paid in produce and then having to sell that. They could rent the land. So the serfs who had lived on maybe a particular plot of ground for several generations had to move on. Where did they go? Well, they moved to the cities and areas where factories were being built to manufacture goods industrially using machines. Karl Marx's theories incorporated an explanation of the transition from feudalism to what became known as capitalism. Now, quite often I find that in sociology texts you began to see references to capitalism before it's really fully defined. I know I've been guilty of it in my classes. So I'm going to put another little link with some information about capitalism in case you need a specific definition of what it is. You probably have an idea what it is, though. It's basically a production in order to make a profit. The means of production, the factories, mines, and so forth, they're privately owned. They're not collectively owned. Okay? The labor which is provided, in a sense, it is also privately owned. A person allegedly freely enters into a labor contract with an employer, agrees to work for a certain level of wages. It's debatable how free that decision is, that agreement. I don't know what you do if you really don't want to accept any of these agreements, at least in the past. So, in theory, ideally, labor is also privately held, capital is privately held, and production is done for a profit. Max Weber defined it basically as industrial production to meet the human needs in the context of bureaucratic organizations that calculate their profit rationally and adjust their operations to ensure a steady or growing profit of some sort. So, capitalism began to develop really before the Industrial Revolution in Italy, although it was not the sort of capitalism we've become accustomed to, which has evolved and morphed into several new forms, and it's It changes, but in many ways it remains the same. Marx felt that capitalism was a temporary phase in our development. It would pass away. It would be superseded by socialism and so forth. Weber was not really fond of capitalism, but he thought it was the best we could hope for. You know, but nevertheless, we'd sacrificed a lot to get the things the goods and services that we have come to depend on by subordinating ourselves to the social arrangements which are characterized by capitalism. So that was one of the sociology developed, trying to understand two things. The classical sociological theory developed in response to and in order to understand some things like the Industrial Revolution, but also the French Revolution, 1789. The King of France was overthrown. Now, the nature of political control and domination in Europe had been changing, but France was one of the last of the large, powerful, absolutist kings whose word was accepted. His commands were obeyed for the most part. Was one of the last to be overthrown. He was more than overthrown. He and his wife, Marie Antoinette, and their children were all executed. And something not quite like democracy, but much closer to it than had been known in most of Europe, developed for a while. Elections began to be common. But after the French Revolution itself basically changed the whole power dynamic of Europe. So you have a change in the economic relationships between people, how people make their living, what they owe to others, etc. The types of goods that are available, the kinds of uncertainties and dangers that you might face in the world, your living environment, living standards not always improved as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So they're trying to explain the Industrial Revolution, the changes and how people interacted as a result of these changes in the economic system, as well as what does it mean for everyday life when people have a little more power to govern themselves. As you probably know, the American Revolution occurred shortly before the French Revolution, which in a sense was accelerated by the French king's support of the American revolutions. They provided a lot of money and accumulated some debts themselves, and when they had several years of bad harvests, that became a real problem, not only for the king but for the subjects of the king. So those are the primary two things that sociology was early social theorists were trying to come to grips with: capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. How did that all fit together? What did it mean? What did it portend for the future? So let's I'm going to start with classical social theorists. As I said, I'm going to start with conflict theory, sometimes called critical conflict theory. I seem to have lost lost the notes I was going to use here. Just a moment. It's primarily just to guide me through this. Okay, just to back up, three broad groups: theory types, conflict theories, structural, functional, symbolic, interactionist theories. Often, sociologists will use whatever approach seems to fit the problem they're looking on. You don't have to swear allegiance to one of these theory groups by any means. You can take an eclectic approach and borrow from one or the other. Conflict theory and functionalist theory, they're both macro level, big picture things. They don't really have much to say about interactions between people, small group dynamics. So if they have to try to come up with an explanation for that, they borrow from the symbolic interactionist, micro interactionist ideas. So, okay. All right. So conflict theories, what are their assumptions? What do the conflict theorists generally believe in common? Okay, they tend to believe that all social systems have a certain amount of inequality, and this inequality creates conflict and conflicting interests between those who control resources of some sort, either material or symbolic. By symbolic, I mean maybe the right to vote, the right to an education, etc., equal rights for both genders, all ethnic groups. So then this inequality, it's systematically produced just through the normal operation of social institutions. To a certain extent, many of them, and they differ on this, conflict is normal and it probably cannot really be eradicated. It doesn't mean necessarily there's, society's breaking down. It's just the way things go. They tend to believe society is held together by, we'll call it force. Coercion is a better word. And this coercion can be either physical, using the army, the police, laws, and so forth, or it can be mental in a sense. We can be taught to believe certain things that make it more likely that we will accept the status quo, the way things are, even if we are systematically disadvantaged relative to more powerful groups in society. When I mention this sort of mental coercion often goes by the name of ideology or false consciousness. You may encounter that in the text in your reading. So they also tend to believe that material, meaning economic, really, interests are really critical in understanding how society operates and how social structures change over time. More important than, for instance, norms and values, your ethical values, or what you think is important in life. Those are important, but not that important in explaining the way things work. Okay. Conflict theory, as we treat it, really it began with the writings of Karl Marx. Now, Marx didn't consider himself a sociologist. He didn't do any empirical research. He was mostly engaged in a debate with economists in Europe. He was in England primarily. He was trained as a philosopher. He was influenced by a German philosopher, as many were and still are in early 19th century Europe, by a German philosopher named Hegel, who advanced the idea that the world changed, reality changed through contradiction, through opposing forces that could not both coexist, and something new came of their conflict between these two opposing forces. Okay, his most important book, Das Kapital, Capital, 3 volumes at least, really, depending upon how you view it. He considered it a study of the economic laws of motion of capital. So by using the term laws of motion, that shows he believed he was doing scientific work. He wanted to dedicate capital to Charles Darwin. Darwin declined. He felt he was a scientist uncovering the way capitalism and the world in general worked. So, and a lot of his assumptions didn't have anything to do with any kind of empirical observations, although to a certain extent, he did employ those observations upon the conditions of the working poor in London after the Industrial Revolution began, or as he saw them in the streets living in London. He ended his life in London. He was from Germany. He lived in several countries as a result of it. Had to leave many countries as a result of his political activities. So, although he was considered himself a philosopher and looking at ideas, he did believe that there was a necessity to take political action to change the world. So, Marx's ideas are kind of at the foundation of modern sociology. You may associate him with communism, which is of questionable validity anymore, since most communist states, with the exception of a few, have closed up shop. Now, it's said, a fellow that came to HCC, very well-known, respected philosopher Slavoj Žižek came to HTC and made to give a talk at Central, made the claim that the most successful capitalists these days are the Chinese, who are communists. And that's somewhat ironic in that capitalism is most efficiently managed by communists. It's debatable the extent to which they're really applying Marxist ideas to their economic systems of economic production, although there are some state-owned enterprises that are collectively owned, so we won't go there, it's not necessary. But one thing about Marx that sociologists took up, he was the first theorist to emphasize that social class, meaning this group you were placed in and judged by others, this hierarchical ordering of people based upon the wealth that you possess or the income you have, that was an important determinant of social change. The relationship between classes was one of the things that drove social change in capitalist society and in feudal society and ancient society as well. So, and that's very important. All sociologists in graduate school are going to have to come to terms with Marx's ideas one way or another. You don't have to accept them all. It's hard to reject all of them, but it can be said that there were certain fundamental assumptions he made about the source of value, for instance, the value of a commodity, that were wrong, that kind of upset an entire house of cards he built upon that. Where you'll find a lot of Marxist ideas applied now is in analysis of cultural products. We sort of have to think the critical theorists, Frankfurt School, the classical critical theorists for some of that. So you will find more Marxist ideas and applications of those ideas in humanities departments, film studies department, communications, media studies, English departments than you might in sociology now. But it's still, many of his ideas are still useful. It's still a valid point of view. There's still a Marxist sociology section in the American Sociological Association, although it seems their numbers grow smaller each year. So, moving on, Max Weber was really not a contemporary of Marx at all. He was, I believe, 22 years old when Marx died. And he's probably more important to contemporary sociology than Marx is in terms of the ideas that are still being applied. One thing he did, he as I said, sociologists had to come to terms with Marx's ideas. Well, Weber critiqued Marx's ideas in a lot of his writings, although Weber did not consider himself a sociologist either. There really weren't any entities, any professions, degree plans, career paths called sociologist at this time. Weber lived 1864 to 1920. Marx died in 1886, born around 1810, I believe, but you don't need to know that. So something that came out of Weber's writings or his claims was that he disputed the notion that ideas, norms, values were not all that important in the development of capitalism specifically or social change in general. He wrote a famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, trying to demonstrate that irrational value commitments, in his view, that were held by Calvinists, a type of Puritan Protestant denomination in Europe, that those were instrumental in developing modern capitalism in Europe. So, in a sense, Weber was interested in rationalization in the world, how the world was becoming more systematic and kind of put in a box and predictable and so forth. You could rationally, using logic, predict what was going to happen if one thing changed and so forth. That this was kind of the tendency over time. The world was becoming more rationalized, and we were also becoming what he called disenchanted. We were ceasing to explain what went on in the world with by using supernatural explanations. Uh, so also, society was becoming characterized by bureaucratic organizations. One other thing which Weber emphasized, which really the symbolic interactionists took up, I would say, whether they deliberately did it or not, it certainly applies to them. Weber understood that there was a place for like statistical examinations of what went on in society and data analysis and so forth, but he believed any explanation that relied solely on statistical correlations and so forth was not a sociological explanation. To understand, to explain something sociologically, you have to know what an action, for instance, let's explaining an action or a belief, you have to know what this action or belief means for the person that's engaged in it or that holds it. So you have to kind of interpret things from their point of view and try to understand that. He developed a term, doesn't translate well into English, Verstehen, could mean empathic understanding, interpretive understanding, where you're trying to get to that point where you just can make a fairly good educated guess regarding what something means to the person that's engaged in it, and it doesn't have anything to do with statistics. So that's sociological explanation for him. Another thinker, which probably should be in this pantheon of classical social theorists, is W.E.B. Du Bois. You may have heard of him. He was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, and he did consider himself a sociologist. It's definitely, you can make a case for, and it's probably true, that he was the founder of sociology in the United States. He did the first large-scale statistical analyses of social groups and relationships between groups in the United States. But because he was African American, he was shut out of a lot of the corridors of sociological power, so to speak. So, but he studied under Max Weber as well in Europe for a while, and he was kind of adopted a lot of Weberian ideas, as all sociologists really have. So Weber, as I mentioned, he kind of has one foot in the symbolic interactionist tradition. Primarily, he's considered a conflict theorist. He developed a more sophisticated version of class relationships, and I say class relationships, really social stratification is the term. Strata is like a layer. The term comes from geology. If you've lived in a place that has contour and isn't flat, and you've driven down the highway where the road is cut through a hill, and you may see layers of rock, those layers are called strata by geologists. Stratification is the same idea, that groups are defined, there are boundaries between them, and there's an ordering along some dimension, something more valuable to less valuable. I don't like those terms like that. They're just put in a particular order that can be quantified usually. So for in the case of economic class, it would be wealth or income. But Weber knew it was more complicated than that, so he added two other dimensions: status, which is related to cultural factors, your education, your religion, things along that line, as well as something he called party, but which was really just your political connections. So he also pointed out that people who were ranked high, so to speak, at least more powerful, or wealthier, powerful, higher status, it tended to coalesce. The people who had the most political power tended to be connected to, or the very same people that had the most income and wealth, and that had the highest cultural status for one reason or another. Marxists would have one explanation for that, which I won't go into. So, Stratification, class status and party, a little more sophisticated and perhaps, but it was a development, it was an expansion of Marx's ideas. He pretty much took Marx's views of social class but added these other two layers. Moving on to functionalism. Emile Durkheim was at the root of functionalist theory. He considered himself a sociologist, the first of these big people really that came along. And he was someone who did believe in empirical observation, statistical analysis. The book he wrote called Suicide, on suicide obviously, was the first big work of data analysis in sociology in general. So his ideas you've probably encountered in the text. I won't go through all of them, but just to recap, structural functionalists today, they're still around. What do they believe? What are their assumptions about the way the social world works? Well, they use like an organic metaphor in the sense that the different institutions in society are like organs in a body. And when the natural state of society is conflict free, it's a state of balance, equilibrium. The body's healthy, all the organs are working properly. When one of the organs is out of whack, then the entire system may become dysfunctional until something happens, maybe some feedback from another system that restores this equilibrium. Now, because they think that society's naturally restabilized, they have trouble explaining social change. Conflict theorists don't have that difficulty. They also believe that these social structures perform functions like social class in the family. That's the only reason they exist. They're providing, they're playing an important role. There's a bit of circular reasoning in that. You know, why does class inequality exist? Because it's functional. And how do you know it's functional? Well, because society still exists. So anyway, you will encounter Davis and Moore's idea about why inequality is functional and necessary in society, economic inequality for the most part. So that's really all I need to tell you about functionalism. You will pick up more of it as you go through the text. Symbolic interactionism. Now, this was primarily developed in the United States. Functionalism, conflict theory grew in Europe. Symbolic interactionism / micro-interactionism or interactionism really developed in the United States. George Herbert Mead is considered, the founder of symbolic interactionism. Mead was a philosopher again. He taught at Yale, I think is where he was. Pardon me that I forgot. Might have been the University of Michigan as well. He never wrote any books, published any articles. The only reason we know anything about what he thought, his ideas, is because his students took very copious notes. In those days, that was the only way you really acquired knowledge in a college. You did not have online courses. You did not have audiovisual aids of any sort. You had no computer to type into, or you could not record anything verbally. It's just his students taking notes, and many of them they compiled their notes and published a book called Mind, Self, and Society, which was very influential. You should encounter Mead when you go through socialization and social interaction. Some other important folks, more contemporary but still deceased, Irving Goffman, very important. He developed a view of social relationships, social interaction, kind of as that's theatrical in a sense. It's based on concepts from theater. Social interaction is a sort of performance. We're trying to present ourselves in a way we think will get us what we want, or at least in a way that we believe is expected of us. Okay, so think of an actor in a play. They're playing a role. It's not necessarily them. They're trying to satisfy the audience. by playing this role. If they're playing the role well, then the audience believes that they are this person. If they make an error, if they miss a cue or use an anachronism, they drop something and issue a 21st century swear word in a 17th century play, then that something kind of breaks. They suffer what's known as embarrassment. Goffman would say that embarrassment occurs when a person has failed in effectively portraying the role that's expected. The audience, sees through them. They know that person is a fraud. That's really at the root of embarrassment. But Goffman's ideas go well beyond that. They're very important. So, symbolic interactionists are concerned with small group dynamics, parents socializing children, interactions between people in small groups in the workplace, on the street, in schools, and so forth. That's their main concern. They tend to believe that social action, social action means any action which takes account of other people. Okay? It's not just some instinctive, solitary action. For instance, if you're walking down the street and it begins to rain and you have an umbrella, you'll raise your umbrella. That's if you're all alone on the street, that's probably just instinctive and so forth. You've got it, so you protect yourself. Now, if it's a crowded street and you need to pay attention to others around you, because if you open your umbrella just because it's time to open it without taking account of other people, you may poke someone with your umbrella, and you may get an unexpected social encounter in the bargain. So, social action. Symbolic interactionists say it's based on the meaning that things have for individuals, the meaning that things, structures, processes, etc., things very generally. And how do you know, where do you come up with these meanings? You're not born with them. Well, you get it from interaction with others. So you're sharing their meanings. And that basically is at the root of social interaction. Learning to share meanings, or discovering you cannot share the meaning of some particular event. For instance, we're maybe polarized politically to an extent we haven't been in this country for some time. So, for instance, not everyone shares the same meaning about the nature of the immigrant experience in the United States. That's just an example. Another example of shared meanings. Think about it can be cultural products, and meanings. These meanings are negotiable. They're not necessarily etched into whatever this thing is that you're sharing. You can change. It can change, and it does change. It will change. So, think about, for instance, a particular song. You've started a new relationship, and there's a song which both you and your partner like a lot, and you become to think of it as your song, and it reminds you of this relationship you're in. Well, suppose the relationship ends and you hear that song. That it's going to have a different meaning for you after that. So, and it may become a ground for a shared meaning with others in the same situation. So, that's not the best example, but if you think about these shared meanings, often involve cultural products, interest in music, films, fashion, and so forth, and you will find groups, social groups, coalescing around a shared interest in a particular performer, or just the process of staying fashionable, following the trends. That definitely involves orientation to others and what things mean to them. If a particular look means something important, means individuality, freedom to a particular celebrity or to your friends. If that's something you value, you're going to adopt that look, and you all have the same, you all share basically the same idea about what it is you're up to. That goes back to Weber's Verstehen. You have to understand what things mean for the people who are engaged in them to come up with a sociological explanation. So, now, in your text, you're going to find some other theories. You're going to see mention of critical theory, feminist theory, queer theory, critical race theory. Most of these you can more or less lump in with conflict theory, because the conflict theorists, many of them, they feel that it's important to understand, to find ways to understand how society works, but you need to know how it works if you want to change it, if you want to make it better for people. So if you want to totally refashion society, you should probably understand something about how it works. You can get these ideas from studying sociology, so to speak, and as well as other topics. Sociology is very broad, though, so it has a dog in many hunts, as to borrow a phrase. So the critical theorists, traditionally critical theory, the idea is sociology, or just theory in general, you don't have to be a sociologist, you apply it in terms of critique. You criticize existing arrangements, the status quo, where one group is systematically privileged over others, whatever that group may be: social class, gender, race, sexual orientation. There's some systematic bias in favor of one group. You study the nature, the development, the origin, what sustains that bias, with an eye towards overcoming it, with an eye towards emancipation, freeing yourself from oppression, and thereby freeing others from oppression as well. So the notion of emancipation is at the root of critical theory. The first critical theorists, so to speak, so-called, were a group of Germans from the University of Frankfurt that left Germany in the 1930s as Hitler came to power. Several of them came to the United States. One, Walter Benjamin, committed suicide when he was denied entry to Spain at the French border. He tended to scatter around. They did not all leave, but generally most of them did. It was not typically they had their background, their early background was in Marxism. And after the First World War, 1918 and 1920, there was a lot of political conflict in Germany. Germany was defeated in the war. Marx's theories basically pointed to Germany as being the place where capitalism would be overthrown and a socialist state would be erected, based upon what his theory said were the necessary preconditions for successful socialist organization. It didn't happen. There were a few small-scale revolutions for a while. There was a People's Republic of Bavaria focused in music. Munich. One of the critical theorists, Herbert Marcuse, was involved in the administration of the People's Republic of Bavaria. But basically it all failed, and the critical theorists after the war, while they were still in Germany, their focus was on trying to understand why the revolution did not happen in Germany, and in fact it happened in Russia, which was not a place that Marx would have predicted it would happen. They had very little industry. They were fairly backward, really, in many ways. And I won't go into all Marx's theories to explain why it should have been in Germany and not Russia. But anyway, they were trying to explain it. A lot of their explanations had to do with culture, music, film, and so forth. Adorno and Horkheimer were famous for writing an essay called The Culture Industry, which was in a book called Dialectic of Enlightenment, which was very influential on a certain generation of sociologists in the United States who came of age during the 60s and early 70s. Anyway, their view was that the production culture, the production, let's say, of the creation of cultural products, art, music, film, had become an industry. It was just being engaged in for profit. Profit by not necessarily by the creator, but the profit of those who distributed the products. And these products tended to have the function of keeping people satisfied, the workers satisfied with the status quo, the way things were. They had a pacifying effect. You know, you would work hard at a job, and perhaps you're being exploited to a certain extent. You're not being paid what you think you're worth, and you're just barely scraping by. But you can come home and you can listen to the radio and listen to some music that calms you. On Saturday evening, you can go to see a film. And as I say, the early Frankfurt School critical theorists were a little elitist. You know, later in the 60s and 70s, obviously, people, well, it may not be obvious, but rock and roll music was an important component of the rebellion against the status quo in the United States and in Europe. It was a part of the the organizations, the lifestyle of those who actively opposed the Vietnam War, or who actively worked for women's equality, for civil rights, and so forth. So popular culture became something which could be empowering and have a critical component of its own, rather than just simply being something which was pacifying the masses in the view of Adorno and Horkheimer. So that's the link where Marxist ideas end up in the humanities, media studies, film studies, English departments, and so forth, through the analysis of cultural products. Okay, but there are other variants of critical theory. One, feminist theory, is sometimes in some texts it's set aside as a fourth theory group, but more often I think it's considered a variant of critical conflict theory, because it is concerned with inequality. You know, that's the explication of how women are systematically disadvantaged vis-a-vis men is kind of at the core, the founding of feminist theory. Feminists are also feminist theorists want to explain the development of the patriarchy, the system where men dominate women in almost every respect, and have for thousands of years. They want to explain how it came to be that women were systematically excluded from what we would call the public sphere, politics, business, etc., and limited to actions in the private sphere, in the home, raising children, cooking, sewing, all those things. How did that happen? And they're interested in understanding this so they can more effectively work towards changing this situation, eliminating the processes, the structures that have produced systematically women's subordination to men. So, queer theory is another type of critical theory. In a sense, it kind of developed out of feminist theory. In a sense, queer theorists, they believe that in traditional theory that there's a heteronormative assumption. Heterosexuality is the norm that's unquestioned in most theories. Traditional sociological theories just accept the male-female binary, not recognizing other genders, other sexual orientations as well. So, and early on, I mean, sociologists were aware of homosexuality. It's not like they ignored it or didn't recognize it, but they tended to analyze it as a type of deviant behavior. Deviance is basically just any type of behavior or belief which is not shared by most people in the culture and is considered by them something not so great, something to be avoided, less than optimal. It's not always is it something which is sanctioned through legal punitive constraints. For instance, some deviance is, of course, armed robbery is definitely deviant. Most people don't do it. Generally, people don't think it's something you should do, and the norms have been embodied in written documents called laws, which are applied to individuals that engage in armed robbery, murder, auto theft, assault, all these things. They are punished, but there's a whole range, drug dealing as well. There's a whole range of deviant acts, broadly defined, for which there is no legal punishment, but it may be some sort of cultural admonishment. You may be shunned, so to speak, shut out, ignored. Okay, so, and obviously that queer theorists would find this a situation that needed to change. So today we have courses in LGBT studies, and not examination of LGBT issues is not limited to a few lectures in a sociology of deviance course. So postmodern theory is another type of critical theory. It's hard to pigeonhole that group. Basically, they reject the idea that you can have a totalizing meaning, a definition that fits everything in the realm it's trying to define, that makes any sense, that means anything. Okay, totality is something that bothers them. I don't want to go too far into that. I'm not really prepared to, but they reject the idea that you can have any of these big picture ideas like Marxism that is really useful in understanding the world. They believe in micro narratives, individual stories, and so forth, as the route to understanding how society operates. They reject science for the most part. They reject the idea of progress. They tend to believe that knowledge, the search for knowledge, is really just the search for power. That there is almost a one-to-one relationship between having power in a particular domain and having knowledge of how things go on. Michel Foucault, one of the theorists most people are familiar with in that genre, postmodern critical theory, wrote a lot about prisons, the medical establishment, sexuality, the definition of the categorization of people as insane and mentally ill, needing treatment from a specialist and so forth. How did that historically come to pass? Because it had not always been the way it is now. So there's a video on him in that you'll come across probably. I think it's linked to a discussion. It's an animation really, and it's worth your time to take a look at it and comment on it. You'll find out a lot more than maybe your textbook is going to share with you. So postmodernism, mentioned queer theory, feminist theory. There's critical race theory as well. Kind of the same, not really the same, but looking at issues of race to show how just about every social institution and process has a racialized element, component, just as there is a gendered component in everything, and a heteronormative component in most everything, if not everything. So that's really really it for the now. I focused more on the classical social theorists and fleshed out some of the contemporary critical theorists just as a way of explaining what that is and how it fits in with conflict theory, because all these critical theorists, they want to see social change. That's the point of studying sociology, trying to flesh out all these relationships, really. You want to change, radical change, really, for the most part. One thing you may notice once you know, encounter some of the applications of these big theory groups, you may notice that if you're someone who's politically engaged and you watch debates between individuals on political issues, often you're going to see behind the disagreements conflict theory and functionalist theory. You're going to see one against the other. So, an example might be you look at economic inequality. Conflict theorists would have an explanation for it that might involve globalization, big picture things. It might involve the systematic attacks on labor unions that weaken the power of workers as determinate causative for some of the economic inequality, which might imply there need to be some large scale, some important fundamental changes in the way things are done in the economic sphere at a high level. A functionalist might take the approach that no, there's nothing. It's a matter of people not having the right skills. So to fix it, all you need to do is encourage people to study particular sorts of fields that are in demand. So you deal with it by enhancing educational systems and so forth. You tinker with existing institutions to re-equilibrate, to restabilize something that's out of balance. So anyway, you may notice that. You certainly don't have to, but it's something you can take away, you might find useful from this course and from understanding, studying these different theory groups and what holds them in common and what separates them. So back to this chart that I mentioned, the big three. Should take a look at those. It summarizes differences and fundamental assumptions of the three groups, as well as identifies some of the major theorists and the things they published. It may be helpful in preparing for the exam. It can't hurt. So, at that, I will stop. Thank you very much.